Shalom, my dear friends. Shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh. Today, the 27th day of the month of Shevat of the year 5778, corresponding to the 12th of February of the year 2018. And today we shall continue with the help of God with our studies of the prophet Hosea in chapter 7, and also with our studies in the laws of the salting and roasting of meat in order to remove all residue of blood of the animal, ready for kosher consumption of meat. And we shall be continuing with our further studies of the discourse of Rabbi Nosson of Breslev, giving us the deeper Hasidic perspective on these laws that do apply right into our kitchen. So with no further ado, further delay, let us go now into today's studies of the prophet Hosea. Shalom, today, the 27th day of the month of Shevat of the year 5778, corresponding to the 12th of February of the year 2018. And we continue now with our studies in the prophet Hosea, entering now into chapter 7, which speaks about how God is wanting to heal backsliding Ephraim and Israel, but each time the sins of the people continue, and we see God's endless compassion for Ephraim, but the need to bring Ephraim back to repent. And here again in this chapter, another discourse of the prophet, we see him alluding to the roots of the whole problem that has been rooted in the originally in the establishment of the monarchy over Israel, which itself was deemed to have been a deviation from God's true will, that God alone should be the king and the monarch over Israel, as we shall see in this chapter. And once again, we must see this against the background that the purpose of Israel, as mentioned in our discussion on the previous chapter, was to rectify the sin of Adam Harishon, of eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the one thing he was commanded not to do, and that led to the sparks descending into Egypt, were redeemed by Israel to be brought up to the land for bringing the land to Tikkun. And this was where Israel failed, as we see recounted in detail in the story of the occupation of the land by Israel from Joshua, Judges, Samuel, through to the end of second book of Kings. So now, turning to our text, Hosea chapter 7. Kerafi leYisrael Venigelo Avon Ephraim V'rohois Shomeroin Ki fohalu shokel V'ganov yovo Poshat gedud bachutz. Kerofil Israel, as I would the words of God in the mouth of the prophet, when, as explained to us by Rashi on this on this verse, when I desire to save Israel and to heal them, their sins are revealed before me, because they always acted with falsehood, and thieves are constantly coming from them and stealing the possessions of other members of the society. And there are whole bands of bandits who are coming to pillage and prey on people all over. And this continuing reproof against the people, verse 2. Uval yomeru lilevovam kol ra'asahom zochorti ato svavum ma'alelehem neged ponai hoyu. They in their wickedness would not say in their hearts that I, God, have remembered and am aware of all of their wickedness. And now their deeds are going to overtake them because all of this was right in front of me, says the Almighty. And it goes right up to the top, verse 3. Berosam yesamchu melech uvachachashehem sorim. In their very evil, they make their king that they have chosen to rule over them happy, and they delight the officials and ministers with their deceptions and their denials. Well, as we shall see in the continuation of Rashi's commentary on this chapter, here the prophet is going right back to the roots of the rebellion of the house of Ephraim, the house of Israel, against the tribe of Judah, the kingship of the house of David. And that started with Yeravam ben Nevat Jeroboam in the reign of King Solomon's son Rechavam, who led the people astray, as we shall be seeing here in our chapter. And this is a very archetypal moment for the whole of the subsequent history of Israel, particularly in our times where Israel, for the first time in 2,000 years, has become an independent state that is, in theory, on the ground, conducted as a democracy, and which has various entrenched powers that rule over the state, and the ultimate deciding authorities of the state are not the Sanhedrin of Torah sages and the righteous, but a group of people who have become entrenched into the establishment and attained positions of influence. And so a lot of the criticism that we will see here of the Hosea, of the generations prior, just immediately on the verge of the exile of the 10 tribes, can be seen indeed recurring again and again in our world today. We can also see this corruption that holds sway in countries all over the world, including some of the supposedly most democratic and most finest in their government. And here we will go back to this concept of the delight of the king in the the treachery and the lies of the people. In a word, verse 4, Kulam menoafim kemo sanur boyeiro me oife yishabois meir Milush botzek ad chumtzosoi. In a word, the one concept that is used by the prophet to relate to all the people is that of ni'uf, which is adultery and any other form of sexual immorality. And here they are all like a burning oven which has been stoked up and has been fired by the baker who's trying to make the dough for the bread. And here we see that the bread becomes a symbol of sexual satisfaction the bread that the baker is going to eat. And we see that this returns with a vengeance against Ephraim in the continuation of this chapter. So at the moment we're talking about how these wicked people let their sins fester in their thoughts, just as a dough is left to rise until it's ready to bake. And the baker would take a rest from stoking the fire in order to have he will stop kneading the dough just so that it will rise properly, ready for the baking. So now we come back to the king. Yom Malkeinu Hechelu Sorim Hamas Miyohin Moshach Yodo Es Loitzetzim. The day of our king. They made sick the ministers with the anger, the wrath of wine. And he gave his hand over to the scoffers and the scorners and the traitors. Well, before we go into the midrashim on this verse, let us just continue with the next two verses, which describe the continuation of this concept of baking and preparing the bread of adultery. Ki kerevu chatanur libom bi'orebom kol halaylo yoshen oifeihem boiker huvo'er ke'esh lehovo. For in their plans to entrap people, to set their ambush, they are stoking up their hearts to do this, just like the baker stokes his oven. And all of the night the baker sleeps so that the oven is burning hot to bake the morning bread. Boker huvoer ke'esh lehovo is in the morning the oven is really all aflame, ready to bake the bread. In other words, to bring the wicked plan into being, into maturity. Verse 7, Kulahom yechamu katanur v'yochlu es shoiftehem kol malchihem enofalu ein koirevohem Eloi. All of the people are in this, all heated up like the oven, and they have eaten up their judges, as we shall see in the Midrash. Anybody who opposed the setting up of the new idolatrous state was actually put to the sword, and eventually all of their kings too have fallen. And the essential problem of the whole of the rebellion of the 10 tribes is that nobody was calling them to God. None of them were calling to God. And as a result of their baking this bread of deviancy, they will go into the exile. Prophesies the prophet, Ephraim bohamim hu yizboilol. Ephraim hoyo ogo beli hafucho. Ephraim is going to be stirred up among the nations just like a dough, a batter is stirred up. The contemporary word for assimilation in Hebrew is a noun made of the verb here in our text, yizboilol, hitbolelut, the reflective of balal. In the laws of Shabbat, we have the concept of the belilo avo and belilo rako, the thick dough and the batter like thin dough. And in a dough, the flour and the water and the other ingredients are all mixed up together. So too will Ephraim be in the nations. But this will be not a desired loaf. It will be one that cannot get turned to bake properly on both sides. So before continuing with this depiction of the malaise of Ephraim, let's go back to our commentators speaking about the inner meaning of these allusions to the day of the king. So let's turn to Rashi on verse 5. The day of our king, the ministers got sick. Rashi says, on the day of our king, on the day that they would crown their kings, appoint their kings over them, our ministers, he said, became sick from the heat of the wine that was burning in them. And the king withdrew from being connected with the good people and the pure people, and he joined up with the scoffers and with the deviants. And Rashi continues in his commentary on verse 7, for they have brought their hearts near like an oven to their intended ambush. They prepared and made ready their hearts for the deed of ambush that they intended to carry out, to pillage and despoil innocent people, just like this oven that people prepare and stoke up in order to bake. All the night their baker is asleep. The baker, says Rashi, after he has stoked up the oven, and after he's prepared their hearts and has already thought up the end of the evil, how they're planning to do it, then Yoshen Ofehem, the baker, sleeps. That is to say, until the morning. They sleep up to the morning, burning like the fire, until they'll be able to bake the loaf. That is to say, complete the wickedness they wish to do. And then on verse 7, that they eat up their judges. Here Rashi specifically refers to the midrash relating to the coronation of Jeroboam. Horguas Sanhedrin Shelohem. They actually killed their Sanhedrin. Because their Sanhedrin, that is to say the Sanhedrin of the 10 tribes, at the time when there was talk of rebelling from the house of David, in the time of Rehoboam, son of King Solomon, the Sanhedrin of the 10 tribes were protesting. Uma also lahem, and what was the result of all this? Kol malkeim noflu lefi she'ein kodesh bohem Eli. All of their kings end up falling, all of the kings of the house of Israel, because not one of them was truly calling to the people to come to God. Of Yerushalmi Bab Mesechus Avodah in the Jerusalem Talmud, in the tractate of idolatry, Dorshu, here is the Midrash, B'yom shem lichus Yerovam, on the day that they appointed Jeroboam, son of Nevat, to be the king, Hechelu sorim Hamas miyayin. The minister started with, they became sick through the heat of the wine, as is specified there in the Talmud Yerushalmi. Asun legabei amrin le kum avadlon akum. They came before Jeroboam and they said to him, get up and make us idols. Amalein ashdo eseramshahu. He said to them, well, now it's the evening. All of the people are drunk already. Now is the time of drunkenness. Maybe now you are drunk. Tomorrow you will think differently. You'll go back on it. They went off and they came back in the morning. He said to them, you go off and come back in the morning. They went off, they came back in the morning. And this is based on our verse here in Hosea chapter 7 verse 8, that they have brought their hearts close to the ambush. They intended like an oven. So in the same midrash it says that Yeravam said to the rebellious people, I'm afraid of your Sanhedrin. So the people said back to him, well, we'll kill them. And that is the meaning of the verse that we have, Ochlu es shoftem, that they ate up their judges. And now when it says about how the king withdrew his hands from the pure good people and joined up with the scoffers and the wicked, continues the midrash, whenever Jeroboam would see a pure, righteous individual, he would sit at his side two scoffers. They would say to the pure man, which generation was the most favored of all of the generations? He would say to them straight off, the generation of the wilderness that received the Torah. They would say to him, did they not worship the stars and the constellations, that say idols? So he would reply to them, since that generation were beloved in God's eyes, they were not actually punished for this. Hush the malka boy lemeva. They would say to this man, keep your mouth shut, you be quiet, because this is what the king now wants to do, to set up idolatry, as in the generation of the wilderness with the sin of the golden calf. They would say to him, the king wants to do this, lemebat kain, dom shamelech roitzelas kain. Rashi translates from the Aramaic of the Midrash and the Yerushalmi Talmud, keep quiet, because the king wants to do exactly that. And as a result, as we've said, the nation of Ephraim will be mixed up in the exile among the peoples of the world. And Rashi comments on the uga b'li hafucho, that this will be a dough or a cake that is not turned over. Rashi quotes the Targum of Yonatan ben Uziel, "Kecharora da'adolei is afchas," like this this stove roll of bread that is baked on the coals, that even before it gets turned over, it already gets eaten. Ugo haroro she'ofen al gecholim. The ugo here is a harora. It's a thick dough that is baked over the actual lighted coals. So going back now to our text, verse 9. Achlu huzarim ekocho והוא לא יודו, גם סביבו זורקו בוי, והוא לא יודו. The strength of Israel was sapped by all these foreign involvements with it, with Ammon and Moab, and with Aram, and with Ashur, and subsequently, of course, Babylon stepped in, and it was strangers that sapped all the strength of Israel, and they didn't know about it. There was this onset of degeneration, this onset of decay, onset of senility that was cast into them, but they were not aware of this. And right in front of them, the very eyes, in verse 10, Ve'ano gehoine Yisrael befono v'lo yishavu el Adonai Elohem v'lo vikshuhu v'chol zois. Rashi explains the word ve'ano as one of humiliation. The pride of Israel was was cast down and humiliated in front of their very face, and still they did not return to the Lord their God. They did not entreat him, notwithstanding. This could certainly be applied in our modern times to what happened in Israel after the 1967 war, when a great wave of national pride spread through the country, but it did not lead to the hoped-for teshuvah process. And then came in 1973 the catastrophic losses of the Yom Kippur War, and since that time, for many stressful years, there were the conflicts with the surrounding nations and with the Palestinian population. All this has sapped the strength of the people, but has certainly brought about a huge wave of teshuvah, but this still needs to go further. And here we see now the diplomatic games of the Northern Kingdom, and these also can be compared in the modern age to the diplomatic manipulations of the leads of the State of Israel, together with the United States and with Russia and with Europe and with India and with other world powers. Verse 11, Vayehi Ephraim kayoino poiso ein lehiv Mitzrayim korau Ashur halachu. Because the people of the generations that Hosea was addressing did not believe that the world is under the control of God and that the whole destiny of Israel is to repent and serve God, they were getting involved all the time in the surrounding nations, as our verse specifies. And Israel is compared to an easily tempted pigeon that is drawn to the bait that has been carefully laid for the pigeon, and she's tempted without knowing that she's going to get trapped there by the bird trapper. And so Ephraim is like this innocent, unwitting Yonah bird. Ein leiv, they simply have no heart to understand. They've called to Egypt, they've gone to Ashur. We see these manipulations in the opening chapters of Isaiah, who was a younger contemporary and a Talmud, student of Hosea, how the northern kingdom and the kingdom of Judah were involved in turning to these other powers. And it's not going to help, it's not going to work. In verse 12, Kasher yelechu eferois aleihem erishtim ki hov hashomayim orideim ayesirahem ki shema la'adosom. It's not going to help, because as they go, wherever they will go, the Almighty will spread against the people his neck. He will succeed in trapping them one way or another, just like the bird to which they have just been compared in the previous verse, the bird of the heavens. The Almighty will bring them down and he will chastise them. Keshema la'adosom, like a reputation to their assembly. Here, the Metzurat David comments, I shall just chastise them just as I've already made known, made heard to their assembly in the wilderness, the words of the oaths and the reproof in the Torah. All of these will come forth against the people, just as a keshema la'adosom, just like that which was heard to their assembly in the wilderness. And now a cry of woe by the prophet, expressing the word of Hashem, Oy lohem, woe to them. Verse 13, Oy lohem, ki nodedu mimeni, shoid lohem, ki fosha ovim, v'yonoichi evedeim, v'heimu diberu holai kezovim. Woe to them that they have strayed from me. Destruction will come upon them on account of they having rebelled against God. V'anoichi eftem, the verb efdem, I would redeem them. I, namely the giver of the Torah, the opening words of the Ten Commandments, Anoichi Hashem Elokecha, I would redeem them many times, but even so they would speak falsehood against me. They would deny God's providence. And the failure of Israel to connect with God through the art of prayer, verse 14, V'lo zo'aku elai belibam, ki yeililu al mishkevoisom, al dogon v'siroish, yisgoiraru yosuru vi. Israel failed to call out to God in their hearts even. Rabbi Nachman states that even if a person is of limited emunah and cannot even get the words out of the person's mouth, the person can cry out in their heart and will be redeemed. But instead they lay wailing on their beds for the material benefits of the world that they desired, and Al dogam v'siroish yiskairaru. On account of their corn and their wine, yiskairaru can be understood in a number of ways. One interesting way is that they went abroad. They went becoming strangers, gerim, to other countries where they thought that they would better be able to get their sustenance. And this indeed has been the case with many hundreds of thousands of Israelis whose parents or previous generations came to live in the land, but they have now gone off to other countries, be it in Europe or in America or in the Far East or other countries, in search of livelihood. And this can also be considered to be a kind of, in some sense, a faithlessness on the part of Israel. This perhaps was how the exile began, that Sennacherib offered the 10 tribes good pastures elsewhere in the hills and mountains of Afghanistan and countries in those areas. And that was how Israel fell into this exile, the 10 tribes. Verse 15, Vahani yisarti, chizakti zeroi oisom, vehelai yechashvuro. Well, here the prophet, as understood by Matzurat David, is saying, I have bound up their arms to strengthen them properly. I have put them in a strong binding to strengthen them. But despite this, they thought against me evil, to say that their strength did not come from me. And whether good or bad, they account everything to mere chance. So their faith is not with Hashem, and for that reason they are to be chastised by this exile. Verse 16, Yoshuvu loy al Hayu kekeshes remyo yiplu b'cherev soreihem mizam l'shoinom zoi lahagom bi'eretz mitzroyim. Even if they will return, they do not properly, says Matzurat David, direct their hearts to the supreme God, but instead they direct themselves to chance, to believing that the world works all through chance and fortune, and they were like the bow in the arms of a cheat and a treacherous person that will not he will not shoot the arrow in the direction that he turned to initially, but he will suddenly swing around to shoot it in an unexpected direction. And likewise, they don't attribute all that is happening to God's providence, but all of a sudden they will turn away from any belief in providence and deny God's providence and attribute everything to chance. And that is why their ministers will fall at the sword of the enemy, as came to pass in the reign of Zedekiah, when he and his ministers were captured and his ministers were slaughtered by Nebuchadnezzar. And in the time of Sancherib, he will certainly have punished any leaders that tried to dispute the exile. And all of this came on account of their tongues, that their tongues fell into a way of speaking a language that is hiding divinity and is casting aspersions on the Torah and on the giver of the Torah, because they deny that God is in providential supervision of everything. And the closing words of our chapter 7, verse 16, Zoi la'agom be'eretz Mitzrayim. The word la'ag is one of scorn and scoffing. And this attribute of disputing God's providence, as we find in a number of cases in the history of Israel in the wilderness, this was the origins of this natural attribute that continued until the time of Hosea and led to the exile of the 10 tribes. So with that, we conclude our studies of the Navi for today, and we'll come shortly to our studies of the laws of Melicha, the laws of the salting of meat, and we should be dealing with a number of interesting issues. And in contrast to previous practice, where we had a session of halacha followed by an interval followed by a study of Chassidut, since our study of Chassidut is now joined with the subject matter of our study of the halachot, there will be a slightly longer interval now of a little around 5 minutes, and then we shall have a continuous session starting with the halachot and then going into Rabbi Nosson's Hasidic discussion of the subject, which we started in the last 2 sessions in Likutei Halachot. So we shall have a short interval now, followed by turning to the laws of prohibition of blood and salting and roasting meat, and the Hasidic perspective on this. Shalom again, my dear friends, and now we come back to our studies today, continuing with the laws relating to blood contained in meat and the need to prepare the meat in order to remove the blood. And this indeed can be considered as a spiritual hygiene. Somebody participating in our classes commented after yesterday's class how very, very intricate are the laws that we are studying. And indeed they are intricate. We are here in our study of the laws as brought down in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, dealing with a level of detail that is fit for not so much the housewife or the householder in the kitchen, but for the candidate for semicha, for rabbinic ordination, who wants to have a digest of the actual practical laws that will relate in the, whether it's the household or the meat factory in questions he might be required to adjudicate. And indeed, this is a serious study. We're not going into all of the Talmudic sources or into the actual texts of the Torah and Shulchan Aruch, the foundations of the law code as laid down in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. We are going into a digest of all of these centuries of discussion, including right up to modern times, and a very concise presentation of these laws. But they're certainly intricate, and we're learning these on the level that they are studied in kollels, which is what these studies are intended to be, kollels around the world where people are seriously studying the halacha and how it actually applies. And therefore, it's quite justified that we are dealing with an intricate subject. And one can indeed think of this as on a par with people studying medicine or pharmacology and anything to do with hygiene and the health of the body. When we come to the salting of meat or the roasting of meat to remove the blood, we're talking about removing every trace that can be removed of something that is considered to bring spiritual impurity into our souls. And that's why we will see that the people who are exacting upon themselves in the performance of the commandments are exacting in what is considered to be a vital area of spiritual hygiene. So let us now come to the next chapter in the work that we are studying, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, on the laws of blood, salting and roasting. Shalom, today, the 27th day of the month of Shevat of the year 5778, corresponding to the 12th of February of the year 2018. And we're continuing now with our studies in the work by the late Rabbi Yaakov Pfeiffer, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, on the laws of blood, salting, and roasting of meat of animals and poultry. And today we will be looking at the laws relating to meat that was cooked without its having properly been salted, where the blood was not properly removed from that meat, whereas we've already seen blood that shifts around in the body of the animal is considered to be forbidden for consumption. But before we come into that, let us take a look at some concepts that will be involved in the laws that we are studying today, which will recur throughout our studies of the laws relating to kashrut. And that is what happens, what is the status where a food that should be intrinsically kosher, like the meat of an animal or some other kosher food, has got mixed into it something that is forbidden for consumption, as in our case, blood that might stay in this meat because it's not been salted. And in other areas of kashrut, we will deal with cases where, for example, milk spilled into a saucepan full of meat, thereby violating the prohibition against cooking milk and meat together. And one of the important concepts that we shall be looking at is how much quantity of food that is permitted to be consumed because it's intrinsically kosher, how much quantity is there in relation to the food that got mixed in, or the substance that got mixed in that is not kosher? If there's only a very small amount of the prohibited food in relation to the bulk of everything else in the pot, then it may be possible to save the contents of the pot for consumption through a concept that is called bitul nullification, where although the substance that is forbidden for consumption exists in the mixed up in the food, the quantity is so small that it's negligible and may therefore be discounted. Now, this applies to cases where a negligible amount of the substance will not make an enormous difference. If even a negligible amount of substance mixed in, for example, if there was a dough that was fermented by fruits of less than 3 years old that are orla, so in the case of orla, since the whole dough has been fermented by this, you'd if the rising the dough depends upon the sour orla fruits, then the entire dough is intrinsically cannot be consumed. But where the mixed-in item is not going to affect the taste or anything else in what is cooking, then it may be able to be discounted. And questions arise about how much quantity of kosher food do you need to outweigh and nullify a small amount of non-kosher food that has got mixed in. And there are a number of subtle differences here which we shall be dealing with in more detail when we come to the laws addressing mixtures of forbidden with kosher food, but we will encounter in our present chapter a couple of concepts that are fundamental to this. One is the concept of bitul berov. Bitul berov, nullification of the non-kosher forbidden item by having a rov, a majority, a greater part of the kosher substance. And the concept of adjudicating on the question of whether the food may be consumed or not on the basis of a majority is rooted in the Torah. It's in Exodus, it's in the portion of Mishpatim, it's in Exodus chapter 23, verse 2, where the Torah says, do not go after the majority to do evil, and do not answer against a conflict, but you may go after the majority in order to incline the case. This is a verse that has many levels of interpretation by our sages, including that a bet din, that in monetary cases consists of 3 people, makes its determination on the basis of a simple majority of 2 against 1. If 2 of the judges rule one way and 1 is in the minority, then the case will be adjudicated according to the 2. The same in capital cases where there is a bet din of 23 people. We need, in order to condemn the accused person, we learn out from our verse here in Exodus chapter 23, verse 2, that even if there was a simple majority of just one more judge in favor of convicting than those who are in favor of acquitting, that is not enough. You have to have a clear majority of at least 2 judges in a capital case. However, in a non-capital case, it's a simple majority, and the same principle is applied in some cases of something that may not be consumed that has got mixed up with other foods that can be consumed, where they are of one and the same thing, 3 pieces of meat, and one was not kosher, the other 2 were kosher. There are cases where a simple rov, a simple majority, that we say that if there were 2 kosher pieces and only 1 non-kosher piece, we will rule that we can consume that dish because the what was non-kosher was nullified by a majority. This is not always. This can't be applied in all cases. There are other cases where, for example, what gets mixed in will affect the taste of the mixture. For example, if somebody mixes in milk with into a meat soup or cream into a meat soup, which is forbidden from the Torah, then a relatively small amount of cream, not just 49%, but a relatively small amount of the cream or the milk will affect the taste of the pot. And in this case, the principle that is applied is 1 in 60. That if there are 60 times kosher food more than the one piece of or one quantity of non-kosher food, this is considered to be nullified. And this principle that is called batel b'shishim, and we shall be encountering both of these concepts in practice in our chapter, the concept of batel b'shishim, where a non-kosher substance is considered to be nullified in 60 parts, is learned out by our sages in a very interesting way from the book of Numbers. It's in the parasha of the Nazir, the Nazarite who took the vow to abstain from wine and to grow his hair long and to abstain from defilement from the dead. When he comes to the completion of his Nazarite vow, he brings a number of sacrifices, and one of them is a peace offering. And the peace offering is an offering that is has shares for the person that brings the offering, a share for the altar, the fats and the blood that goes up on the altar, and a share for the priests. And in Book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 19, the Torah is talking about this peace offering that the Nazarite brings. It starts off in verse 17 of chapter 6. The ram of the peace offering he makes into a zevach shlomim, a peace offering to the Lord, together with a basket of unleavened bread, and the priest conducts the service of offering this person's meal offering and the appropriate wine offering. And that's when, in verse 18, the Nazarite shaves his hair at the entrance to the temple, and he takes the hair of his Nazarite vow and he puts it on the fire under the seething pot of his peace offering of the ram. And then the priest takes the zro'ah, that is the foreleg of the ram that is being cooked. He takes that out of the pot where the ram is being roasted, together with one of the loaves of unleavened bread and a thin wafer of unleavened bread, and he puts it on the hand of the Nazarite, and there's this wave offering, and then the priest takes this foreleg of the ram, and that is the priest's portion. And being the priest's portion, that means that is kodoshim, that is holy meat, that is for the priest only and not for the Nazarite. The Nazarite may not eat from the forearm, the zro'ah, the foreleg of the ram. And that means that from the point of view of the Israelite, that forearm is not for consumption, like anything that is unkosher for an individual. And here it is cooking with the rest of the meat of the ram, cooking in the pot under which the Nazir burns his hair. And we say that the holiness of the forearm, which is only allowed to be consumed by the priest, will not affect the rest of the meat in the pot. And our sages performed a calculation that the forearm of the ram is 1/60th of the bulk of the rest of the body of the ram. So since the forearm is only 1/60th of the total. It is considered to be batal b'shishim. In other words, there's 61 parts. One part is the forearm, and 60 parts are the meat of the rest of the ram. So from here is derived the concept of something that is unkosher. In this case, the forearm of the foreleg of the ram for the non-priest, where even though its taste may have entered into the rest of the part is still considered to be kosher, may still be consumed. With that, those introductions to those two concepts of bitul, of the nullification of isur, of something that is prohibited, we go back to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of the laws of blood, salting, and roasting of Rabbi Yaakov Pfeiffer, alav shalom, to chapter 2, the law of meat that has been cooked without having previously been properly salted. He tells us that meat that was not salted and was not roasted properly before they cooked it, if there was not in the pot in which that meat was cooked at least 60 times the quantity of the unsalted meat, everything is forbidden for consumption, because on account of the boiling of the cooking process, the blood that was in the meat comes out, it exudes during the cooking, and that blood being forbidden for consumption subsequently causes to be forbidden the dish in the pot. And more than that, the blood, as it exudes, will then again get absorbed back into the meat, and therefore everything is forbidden on account of blood that has moved from place to place in the meat and the flesh. And meat that has been cooked in this way, the meat itself, cannot be rectified neither by salting nor by roasting, because there's not sufficient power in the process of salting and roasting anymore to cause to be exuded blood that has been absorbed into the meat on account of the cooking process. Salting and roasting just won't get it out. Now, if the contents of the pot in which the meat, from which the blood had not been removed, fell or was cooked, if the contents were 60 times the quantity of the piece of meat, then all of the rest of the contents in the pot are certainly permitted for consumption. If a small quantity got in, if it's less than 1/60th of the total, then the rest of the contents of the pot is certainly permitted, because any blood that may have separated from that meat will immediately be nullified through the principle of 1 in 60, because it's as if it just disappeared from the world. However, the meat itself is forbidden for consumption. The piece of meat that had not had the blood removed, that may not be eaten. And the reason is because we fear that perhaps not all of the blood was exuded from the meat. Not all of the blood that was previously absorbed in the meat before it was cooked actually was exuded during the cooking process, and that the blood that was left in the meat because of the boiling of the cooking process might have shifted from place to place. We've already seen in the previous chapter that blood that moved from place to place in the meat itself is not permitted for consumption. And again, this piece of meat cannot be fixed. It has no repair, neither by salting it nor by roasting it, because, again, as we saw previously in the law of if there was less than 60 parts of the contents to the piece of meat, here again, even though we may permit the rest of the contents of the pot, because the amount of blood that got mixed up was negligible, the piece of meat itself, we fear, may have still blood in it that moved from place to place. It cannot be corrected either by roasting or by salting, because they don't have sufficient power to remove blood that was absorbed back into the meat and moved from place to place. Well, now, in the 6th paragraph of this this chapter 2, part 1, we come up with a very interesting and important principle in the halacha. What happens in a case where there will be considerable loss monetarily if we were to rule that the contents of the pot and the meat would have to be disposed of when the meat had not been properly kashered before it was put into the pot? This is called hefsed merube, where there's substantial loss. Now, we are not manipulating our laws here by saying that the law changes if there will be considerable loss. If the loss were to be negligible and we had to throw out the little lump of meat, no big problem. But if you're in a food production plant with a huge amount of meat and something that was not properly salted got in with the kosher meat, and even though there was 60 times the rest of the content of the pot, if we had to simply lose even 1/60th, that will be substantial financial loss. We shall see here the reason why we may even be able to rule leniently and to permit the meat. And let us understand that the rabbi who is adjudicating such questions may often have to adjudicate them for people who are poor and who do not have the resources to simply have a part of their next meal thrown out because something fell in. And so let us follow through the words of Rabbi Yaakov Pfeiffer, where he says, in a place of substantial loss, we may rule leniently to permit even the meat itself to be consumed. That is, meat that was cooked in more than 60 times itself kosher vegetables and gravy and everything else. And the reason for this is because we do allow that quite possibly all of the blood that had been in the meat was in fact exuded outwards through the cooking and boiling process, and therefore all of the blood was batal b'shishim. It was all nullified in 60 times itself. And that if indeed there was some minimal amount of blood still left in the meat that was not exuded, that blood would not in any case have been shifted from its place, and blood that is not shifted from its place at all in the meat is permitted, as we saw in the previous chapter. So we see how a leniency may be permitted in certain circumstances, because here we are dealing in some cases with rabbinical prohibitions, as in the case of the or less stringent prohibitions, and we see where there is room for the authority who is ruling to rely upon his understanding of the halacha, and when it is possible to make a lenient ruling to avoid undue loss where this is permissible. So with that, let us now turn to the Likutei Halachot dealing with these laws. And now today we come to continuation of the discourse which we started studying yesterday, Likutei Halachot Yerodea, the laws of fat and blood, chelev and dam. We have not yet reached the laws of we've not yet reached the laws of blood here, but as mentioned yesterday, they are both related together, the prohibitions of consumption of chelev, fat, and blood, because they are both parts of the offerings in God's altar, and that is what Reb Nosson now addresses. For that reason, because of the very high and exalted spiritual power contained in the chelev fat, the very essence of the sacrifices of animals on the altar was actually the chelev fat. In the cases of all of those sacrifices that were eaten, like the sin offering and the guilt offering and the peace offering, where only part of the animal was burned and the rest of the meat was consumed by the priests, or in the case of the shalom and peace offerings and Torah offering by the Nazarite offering, as we saw today, by the owner, it's essentially the chalev, the fat that is burned on the altar, the fat with all this stored up energy. As we saw yesterday, the energy is money. In a non-sacrificial animal, the fat, because of its high energy concentrate, has a monetary value and may be traded in. But in the case of dedicated sacrificial animals, specifically, it's the chalev that is offered on the altar. For there is clothed in that chalev fat this very exalted livelihood, except that we as human beings do not have the power to sift out and purify and clarify that godly power in the fat of the animal through the normal process of shchita, slaughter, and consumption. In the case of regular meat, when it's been properly slaughtered and when it's been properly koshered, those permitted parts of the animal, we do have the power specifically to elevate the divine sparks in them. But that is not the case with the chalev, because the chalev fat is itself a flaw in the physicality of the being that leads to a flaw into their whole thinking processes, which is the holy language in which the true divine sechel addresses us in our inner thoughts. But the chalev covering over the klayot kidneys, these are covering over the holy thoughts and putting forth unholy, evil thoughts, and this is the impurity of the serpent that the serpent put into Eve. Because Eve herself was intended to be the very perfection of the divine tongue. Eve's name, Havor, comes from the Hebrew word to tell, to relate. Yom leyom yechaveh da'at, day to day will express and relate inner knowledge. And this is what Eve was intended to be, to reveal godliness through the power of the mouth, the power of language. But because there is this impurity of the serpent, there is no power in the knife of the slaughter process to subdue this evil that is attached to the chalev meat. And for that reason, it's not possible for us humans to sift out the good sparks here through our normal consumption. But through the fire upon the altar, there the fat is burned and it is consumed, and it is all of the evil there is completely eaten up and destroyed completely. And then the inner vitality of holiness that was in the chalev rises up, and through this comes great nachas ruach, great bliss and delight before the Almighty, as the Torah states about the animal offerings. Ishe reach nechoach l'Hashem. This is a fire offering, a fragrant, a pleasing fragrance to the Lord. And of course, we need to understand all of this against the background that essentially it is we that are required to offer up our fat on the altar of God's service by putting our energy and powers into our devotions, our studies, our performance of the commandments, and all that is incumbent upon us to do to discharge our responsibilities in this world. This is our offering. But in the case of the animal with which we're specifically dealing now, the Torah states, Kol chalev le'Hashem. All of the chalev fat is only for the Lord, because the very exalted holiness ascends from the chalev fat on the altar to the Lord, because the fire is the essential repair of this chalev fat, which is the expressed through the the flaw in the covenant which comes about when people follow the evil counsels of their inclination and to perform acts of immorality and acts that deviate from the Torah, which denies the covenant of the Torah. But the fire is the repair, like the Torah states in the laws of the returning soldiers who came from the war with Midian, how they were to kosher the metals, the gold, and the parts, utensils they had taken from the Midianites. The Torah says there, "Kol davar asher yovo ba'eish ta'aviru vo'eish v'toher." Everything that comes into fire, namely a metal saucepan, if you want to kosher it, ta'aviru bo'eish, you have to perform the hag'alah, the koshering process, by passing it through the fire. And then, says the Torah, then v'toher, it becomes purified from having been used for unkosher foods. Numbers chapter 31, as Reb Nachman explains elsewhere, on this concept of burning out the sins and the sinful thoughts through the fire of devotion to Hashem. For the chelev fat embodies the impurity of the serpent. This is the heat of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, like the heat we saw in the stoking of the fire in the portion of the prophet Hosea the chapter that we studied today, the heat of the evil inclination, because the fats in the body heat up the body and they cause the blood to boil. And through this comes all of the fire and burning of our physical lusts. And for that reason, the essential repair is through fire, like the verse in Numbers just quoted, ta'aviru bo'esh, remove what has been absorbed into the pot through the fire. It's the fire of the altar that is the repair of the chelev fat, and therefore the holy power in the chelev is purified and refined through the fire on the altar. And that's why, as the Torah elsewhere states, chelev may be used for any other purpose, but may not be consumed. Even though it's forbidden to be consumed in the case of a non-sacrificial animal, a regular animal that is slaughtered for consumption by regular people for chulin, there is great need for the chelev fat, even for the children of Israel. Namely, it's used for kindling the lamps, for giving light, because it does contain this very exalted vitality, except that that vitality cannot be refined through our process of eating, as in the case of our ingestion of normal kosher foods, vegetables, fruits, grains, and kosher eggs, cheeses, kosher meats, and so on, which we can, but chelev we cannot. And for that reason, most of the tikkun, the repair, the use of chelev is through fire, because through the fire it is purified, and out comes the vitality in the light produced by the tallow, and therefore the main use of the chelev fat is precisely for lighting of lamps, because the chelev fat, which came from the fats of the body that were fueling the brain, out of the chelev fat now comes the kindled lamp, because from the kindled lamp of the soul that the vitality that is in the chelev fell, namely from the spirituality of the mind and the brain, which is considered as a kindled lamp, and it's through the fire of the hadlakat, of the kindling, that the power in the chelev fat is clarified and refined and purified, and then its vitality comes out as a great light, because so much vitality, exalted vitality, was contained in it. Well, now in the ensuing section, Reb Nassan will be talking about the the prohibition of blood itself, and associated with his discussion of the chalev, and that we will come back to on Thursday with the help of God in our next session. With that, my dear friends, I wish you shalom from the holy city of Jerusalem. Look forward to continuing our studies in our next session. Shalom, bracha, and hatzlacha, blessing and success.